Hello everyone, and thank you for joining my lecture on Chapter 4, Tissues. Here are 3 interesting facts about tissues. 1, while most cells are able to reproduce, nerve cells cannot. 2, fascia, a very strong connective tissue that lines muscles, has a tensile strength of 2,000 pounds. And number 3, blood is a type of connective tissue. As we make our way through this lecture, you will come to understand that tissues differ from each other in a variety of ways. They differ in their size and shape. They differ in their amount and kind of material between each cell, and they differ in their special functions that they perform. In this lecture, we're going to cover the 4 main kinds of tissue that compose the body's many organs, and they are epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nerve tissue. Do you know which one of these 4 images corresponds to each type of tissue? Before we begin our discussion on the different types of tissues, I would like to spend a moment talking about what is between those different tissue cells. And what is between those different tissue cells is something called ECM. Now this is what we call the interstitial space. The interstitial spaces are those spaces between cells. So ECM stands for extracellular matrix. So we're going to talk a little bit about how tissues differ in the amount and kind of matrix that fills up these interstitial spaces, or these spaces in between the cells. Now, when we talk about epithelial tissue, like the tissue that makes up our skin, this type of tissue forms a seal that protects our deeper tissues. And because of this, the cells are really closely packed together. So there's not a lot of matrix in between these epithelial cells. Now, connective tissue, on the other hand, is mostly matrix with very little cells and mostly composed of the ECM. Then we have tissues like blood. Yes, blood is a tissue, and its matrix consists of plasma. Plasma allows it to maintain its fluid form unless there is a situation where a clot needs to be formed, and this allows it to create that fiber type matrix that you would see in a scab when a wound is healing. Bone, on the other hand, its matrix is encrusted with mineral crystals, and this makes the tissue really hard and serves as a great support structure for our body. Now, there's other types of proteins that also help to give our tissue support and structure, and these are collagen and elastin. Collagen gives a tissue flexibility, and elastin gives tissues its stretchability and its ability to come back to its original form, kind of like a rubber band. And lastly, there are molecules within these matrices, or ECM, that's between the cells, like polysaccharides and proteoglycans, which are sugars, and these sugars serve different functions like linking cells together, absorbing shock, regulating function, and offering lubrication. So, what is its surgical application? Interestingly, scientists have found that they can harvest certain extracellular matrices in different animals like pigs, and they can sterilize that matrix and they can turn it into a type of tissue that we can use to repair tendons and ligaments in the human body. Epithelial tissue forms sheets that cover the body and line body cavities. Epithelial tissue also lines various parts of the body that forms ducts and tubes. Because their cells pack so closely together, there is little or no interstitial fluid or matrix between them. This also means that there is no room for blood vessels. So epithelial tissue gets its oxygen and nutrients from nearby blood vessels in the connective tissue that underlies epithelial cells. This makes sense if you think about any time that you had a paper cut. Typically, paper cuts don't bleed, and that's because a paper cut occurs in the outermost layer of our skin, the epidermis, which does not have any blood vessels in it. Now, the epithelial tissue consists of a glue-like layer called the basement membrane or the subcuticular layer that connects epithelial tissue to its connective tissue foundation. Epithelial cells are also classified by shape and arrangement. The two types of arrangement that we're going to talk about are stratified and simple. And there are 4 different shapes that we're going to talk about are squamous, cuboidal, columnar, and transitional. Epithelial tissue is one of 2 types of tissues that has the greatest ability to repair itself. Epithelial tissue, like I mentioned before, is classified by arrangement and by shape. The first shape that we're going to talk about is squamous epithelium, and squamous means flat and scale-like. There are 2 different types of squamous epithelium. One is simple squamous epithelium, and the other is stratified squamous epithelium. Single or simple squamous epithelium can be seen right here. I'm circling in red. It has a single layer of cells. Now these cells are very closely packed together, like I mentioned, and this one layer makes it very, very thin. So its job, remember, form follows function, is transport or absorption. And a good example of this is the absorption of oxygen into the blood that takes place through simple squamous epithelium that forms the tiny air sacs in the lungs. The second type of squamous epithelium that we're going to talk about is this stratified squamous that I'm circling in green. Stratified squamous epithelium is composed of several layers of closely packed scale-like cells, and its primary function is protection. And a good example of this is our skin. Here is an image of the 2 different types of squamous epithelium. On the right, we're looking at simple squamous epithelium, which are these scale-like cells that are in a single layer. And on the other side, we're looking at stratified squamous epithelium. And this is a really great image because you can see that very well-defined basement membrane at the bottom where the cells are a lot more closely packed together. And then as we move up, the embryonic or the newly generated cells that are actually generated near the basement membrane and the more mature layers that are near the top. Cuboidal epithelium gets its name from the shape of the cell. The shape of the cell is cube-like, meaning it's about as wide as it is tall. Now, cuboidal epithelium, both simple and stratified, make up the tubes or ducts of our secretory glands, like our endocrine glands and exocrine glands. So their job is to create pathways where different fluids can be excreted. Simple cuboidal epithelium typically makes up tubes or ducts that secrete saliva, digestive juices, and hormones, whereas stratified cuboidal makes up ducts or tubes that secrete sweat, such as in our sweat glands. The third type of epithelial tissue that we're going to talk about is columnar. Columnar cells are taller than they are wide, thusly they look like a column. Simple columnar epithelium arrange themselves in a single layer and typically line pathways where there are mucus-secreting cells called goblet cells. These types of cells specialize in absorption, and that's why they work really well in areas like the small intestine, the large intestine, and the stomach. Pseudostratified epithelium looks like it is made up of many layers of cells. However, this is an optical illusion. There's only one layer of cells in pseudostratified epithelium. If you take a close look at this image, you will see that each pseudostratified epithelial cell touches the basement membrane. There's only one cell layer thick. Also notice the little hair-like projections on the surface of the cell. These are called cilia. Remember, we talked about cilia in our previous chapter and how these cilia have the ability to move in unison. This makes pseudostratified epithelium the perfect choice for lining the trachea or the windpipe. These cilia work in unison to sweep dust particles and other foreign objects up and out and away from the lungs. Stratified transitional epithelium is found in body areas that are subjected to stress and have the innate ability to stretch. Typically, up to 10 layers of differently shaped cells of varying sizes are present when the tissue is not stretched. Can you think of any examples? If you said the bladder, ureter, or urethra, you would be correct. Another structure where transitional epithelium is found is the male prostate. Now, I typically get questions about the uterus and what type of cells are there, and are these transitional epithelium? The answer is no. The uterus has specialized cells called prismatic cells that line and comprise the uterus. Not only is connective tissue one of the two tissue types that has the greatest ability to repair itself, it is also the most abundant tissue in the body. This makes it the most widely distributed tissue in the body. There are multiple types of connective tissue, and these different types of tissue look differently and they function differently. Some examples would be connective tissue that forms a supporting network like our bones, or transports substances through the body like our blood, or helps to defend us against microbes and other invaders. Remember, I mentioned previously that connective tissue has relatively few cells in its intracellular matrix, so it's mostly made up of ECM and few cells. We're going to talk about 5 different types of connective tissue and their subcategories. The different types that we're going to talk about are fibrous, or connective tissue proper, bone, cartilage, blood, and hematopoietic tissues. The first type of fibrous connective tissue that we're going to talk about is loose fibrous tissue. Loose fibrous tissue is also referred to as areolar tissue, and it is also the most widely distributed of all connective tissues throughout the body. Areolar tissue or loose fibrous tissue is comprised of this loose, soft, sticky, gel-like matrix that makes it very flexible, very strong, and very stretchy. That's because it's primarily composed of collagen and elastin fibers. One common type of areolar tissue is fascia. Fascia is a very tough but flexible fibrous tissue that helps to bind skin, muscles, bones, and other organs of the body together. I like to think of adipose tissue or fat tissue as little storage units for energy. The job of adipose tissue is to store lipids such as triglyceride fats, and there are two different types, white fat and brown fat. White fat is known for its very shiny appearance because of the triglycerides that are stored there. Brown fat is actually used when the body is cold to produce heat. Adipose tissue also secretes hormones that regulate metabolism and fuel storage. Another type of fibrous connective tissue is called reticular tissue. Reticular tissue consists of thin, delicate webs of collagen fibers and is characterized by its net-like appearance. Here you can see the reticular tissues labeled as RF, reticular fibers. Now these fibers are commonly found in bone marrow, the spleen, and the lymph nodes, and the job of reticular tissue is to give support to the nearby cells of the tissue. The last type of fibrous connective tissue that we're going to talk about is dense fibrous tissue. Now there's two different types of dense fibrous tissues, regular and irregular, both being made up of bundles of strong collagen fibers. Regular dense fibrous tissue has a very uniform arrangement like the top picture and typically composed tendons, and then irregular dense fibrous tissue is characterized by a chaotic swirl of tangled bundles like you can see in the bottom image, and this type of tissue typically comprises the deep layers of the skin. Now we're going to move away from talking about fibrous connective tissue and talk about bone as a connective tissue. Bone has a calcified matrix, and this is because the collagen bundles pack closely together and are encrusted with mineral crystals containing calcium. The function of the bone is to support and protect. And there's two different types of bone, compact or cortical, and cancellous or spongy bone. So let's talk about compact bone first. Compact bone or cortical bone is the hard outer shell of the bone or the walls of bones. Cortical bone or compact bone has these building blocks called osteons, and if you look at the bottom right of the screen, you can see these little almost like rings of a tree are referred to as Haversian systems or osteons, and these are the building blocks of the cortical bone. You can also see on the far left how the compact or cortical bone, this is the head of the femur, forms the outside or the shell of that femur. Cancellous bone, on the other hand, has this inner lattice work pattern or almost appears to look like a sponge, and that's the image that's in the middle is an example of what spongy bone would look like. Now the lattice-like pattern helps to add rigidity to the bone, and this makes this type of bone perfect for weight bearing. And you can see here on the bottom left image that pink is the spongy bone, and it literally forms the weight bearing portions of the bone or the ends of the bone. Now within these little cavities of the spongy bone is where the blood-forming hematopoietic tissue lives. There are three types of cartilage. These are fibrocartilage, hyaline cartilage, and elastic cartilage. Now the name of cartilage cells are called chondrocytes. These chondrocytes are what give cartilage tissues their Swiss cheese type appearance. So we're going to talk about fibrocartilage first, and I'm starting with this one because it is the most fibrous, and it is the least flexible. This means it's the most densely packed tissue with collagen fibers. Examples of where fibrocartilage can be found is in cushions between the vertebrae and the knee. So the discs in between the vertebrae and the meniscus between the ends of the femur and the tibia. The second type of cartilage, hyaline cartilage, has a moderate amount of collagen fibers, and it is also the most common. It has a medium type of flexibility, and areas where it can be found are the bronchi and the ends of the bones. Lastly, elastic cartilage is the most flexible because it has the fewest number of collagen fibers. And examples of elastic cartilage are the ear. Your ear is very bendable and flexible, and also in the larynx or the voice box. The last two types of connective tissue that we're going to talk about are blood and hematopoietic tissues. Now we're just going to briefly cover these here because we will cover them in greater detail in chapter 13. So for now, it's important that we understand that blood has a fluid matrix, and this matrix is called plasma. And the job of the blood is twofold. First, it is a great transportation system for different substances, nutrients, for the body, and secondly, it serves as a protective mechanism for the body when we're talking about our immune system. And then hematopoietic tissue is found in red bone marrow cavities. It is also found in the spleen and the lymph nodes, and the job of this tissue is to manufacture red and white blood cells. Now we're going to shift gears and talk about three different types of muscle tissue. The three different types of muscle tissue are skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. So let's talk about skeletal muscle first. Skeletal muscle is also called striated muscle or voluntary muscle. And you can see how the skeletal muscle has these little lines, and those lines are referred to as striations. The really cool thing about skeletal muscle is that we can move these muscles at will, not like our smooth muscles. Smooth muscle is non-striated and is also referred to as involuntary muscles. These are the muscles that we can't control on our own, such as the muscular layer of the vessel walls, or the muscular layer of intestines or ureters or other tubular shaped organs. The third type of muscle is kind of a combination of the two, and it is a specialized muscle called cardiac muscle. It is striated, but it is involuntary. So it is a combination of the two types of skeletal and smooth muscle, and it makes up the heart wall. The really cool thing about cardiac muscle is it is characterized by these intercalcated discs, and you can see right here how these intercalcated discs allow each cell to connect to one another. And this is what enables all the cardiac muscle cells to contract at the same time. The last type of tissue we're going to talk about is nervous tissue. Now, one single nerve cell is referred to as a neuron, and a neuron has three basic components. Now, the body of the neuron is referred to as the cell body, and it's this very darkened shape here that I'm circling in purple. And the cell body has two structures that branch off from it. And the first structure we're going to talk about is the axon. Now, the axon that I'm going to circle in blue here There's one axon per neuron, and the job of the axon is to carry nerve impulses away from the neuron to the next neuron in line. The third part is the dendrites. Now, while there's only one axon carrying information away, there are multiple dendrites per neuron receiving information into the cell body. Now, there are little supporting cells, and you can see all of these little blue dots. I'm circling in yellow, and these supporting cells are called neuroglia or glia, and the job of these is to connect and support nerve cells. The function of nervous tissue is to allow different structures of the body to communicate with one another. Nervous tissue also is responsible for controlling all the functions of the body. Now, as we get farther along in our course, we will spend an entire chapter talking about nervous tissue. So for now, just have this basic understanding of nervous tissue. Do you remember which tissues regenerate the easiest? If you thought of epithelial and connective tissues, you would be correct. Epithelial and connective tissues are the two types of tissues that regenerate the most easily. The tissue that has the most difficult time regenerating itself is nerve tissue. When healing occurs in connective tissues, what happens is collagen fibers become active and they fill the gap where the injury took place. Now, if it's a small gap and it's a relatively small injury or wound, then there's a potential that the wound could be replaced by normal tissue later. However, if it is a very large wound or cut, or the cell damage is extensive, it may remain a dense fibrous mass called a scar. A specific type of unusually thick scar that can develop in the lower layer of the skin is what you see here, called a keloid scar. This concludes our review of Chapter 4, Tissues. Make sure that you identify your muddy points and that you're ready to discuss those during class. Thank you for listening.